The Buffalo Bills' initial roster has been set, and I'm breaking it down today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Well, folks, the Bills have created their initial 53-man roster for the 2023 season, and it's time to break it all down. I want to start by discussing Von Miller and Boogie Basham, a trade there, and then we'll get into the decisions that were made offensively and defensively. Now, something I always say is that this is the initial roster. There's no such thing as a final roster. The roster is never final. There's going to be moves that happen tomorrow that's going to tell you that this is not the final roster. So this is the initial look at it. I think the framework is very much set, but there are some things that are going to happen still as the Bills prepare the roster that they're at least going to use against the Jets in week 1. But let's start with the two, I think, big pieces of information that we received on Tuesday. The first one being that Von Miller will start the year on the PUP list. And I know there was some momentum that perhaps he'd be available week 1. I always doubted that that would be the case. And so Von Miller starts the season on the PUP list. That means he has to miss at least 4 games. So he is eligible to play his first game in week 5 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, which, as you know, is the game in London. And I just don't know if the Bills are going to use that as the debut for Von Miller. And my position all along, as you know, has been that he plays his first game week 6, which is the game after the London game. It's a home game, Sunday Night Football, New York Giants. I feel like that's your first exposure to Von Miller in 2023. Now, perhaps it is week 5, but I think the Bills will want to avoid the cross-country trip for Von Miller to London and just have him ready to go for that Giants game. And obviously, the Bills' pass rush is at its best when Von Miller is part of the equation. And they'll have to make do without Von Miller for at least the first 4 games, which week 1 at the Jets, week 2 home against the Raiders, week 3 at Washington, week 4 home against Miami, and then if he does miss week 5, of course, that's the London game in Jacksonville. Now, you'd certainly love to have him for the Jets game. That's not going to happen. You'd love to have him for Miami. Certainly Jacksonville would be a tough game on, I'm calling it on the road, a neutral site game. You're going to be better with Von Miller, but you're hoping that the difference this time around without having Von Miller as opposed to last year is Leonard Floyd is kind of your X factor there. A guy that's had 9 sacks in each of the last 3 seasons. It's another name that you can lean on in addition to Greg Rousseau and Ed Oliver and AJ Epinesa and Jordan Phillips. So those guys are really going to have to carry the load there, if you will, when it comes to making sure these quarterbacks that the Bills are facing early in the season aren't comfortable. But the big thing here with Von Miller is you want Von to come back and be Von, right? And for that to happen during the stretch run. That's what hurt so much about not having Von Miller last year. when he was healthy for whatever it was, 11 games, Von Miller was everything Brandon Beane had in mind when he gave him that contract. And then the sad part was you didn't have him for the stretch and when you needed him most. Let's hope that's not the case this year, where Von takes that time to get himself ready to go. And when he's back, he's all the way back. The other move that happened, I guess, before all the cuts were announced is Boogie Basham being traded to the New York Giants. And this was somewhat of a surprise for me. I know that some of you guys called this, especially when the Bills started him in that last preseason game. A lot of people said, look, I think they're trying to put him out there and audition him for a trade. And you guys were absolutely right about that. I had my reservations about it because it was year 3 for a second-round pick, and we hear Sean McDermott talk so much about year 3 being that defining season where you really know what you have in a player. And the Bills have certainly had some misses on day 2, and you felt like maybe the Bills would want to keep Boogie Basham and see what he can do. And I thought Boogie had a good preseason, thought he had a good camp. I thought there was a plan for him. They were using him in a lot of different ways. Well, turns out he's a New York Giant. And so let's talk about this real quick. The return is very modest. The Bills send Boogie Basham and a 7th-round pick in 2025 for a 6th-round pick in 2025. I mean, there's not a whole lot that you can be excited about with that return. I mean, the Bills got more for Cody Ford than they did Boogie Basham. So I'm certainly was hopeful for more back for Boogie. But we always have to be reminded that value isn't what you think somebody's worth or something is worth. It's worth what somebody's willing to pay. And I'm guessing there wasn't more out there for the Bills to get than what they got. I don't think they just settled for, hey, a 2025 swap for a 6th and a 7th round pick. You would hope to get more, but value is what someone is willing to pay. And I don't think that Beane didn't take the opportunity to get more. I think that's what the market was. And clearly the team thought Shaq Lawson and Kingsley Jonathan, both these guys make this roster over Boogie Basham. They thought they were better options and they moved on. But I think there's something out there that's kind of bothered me in the discussion about this trade. I've seen a lot of comments about Brandon Beane missing on the pick, on the Boogie Basham pick, a 2nd-round pick. Folks, that's not new information. I mean, I shared with you that I was encouraged with his growth this preseason, but Boogie was always at best defensive end 4 without Von Miller and defensive end 5 with Von Miller. And that's not good enough for a 2nd-round pick entering their 3rd season. So the point that I want to make here is that don't count it against Brandon Beane twice. It was already a miss before the trade. And whatever hope we were clinging to that he would turn into this meaningful player was always pretty unlikely given where he was on the depth chart. He wasn't going to pass Von Miller and Greg Rousseau and Leonard Floyd this year. So yeah, it's a missed pick. It was a missed opportunity to improve the football team in the 2nd round. No question. But let's not act like that was new information. We've already known that based on how things have played out to this point. It's a miss. Brandon Beane has to pick better in the 2nd round especially. And there's been some missed opportunities there for sure. I've criticized him for that. But don't count it twice. It's like when you're scouting a football player and you know that they're slow because you watched them on film in college and then they run a slow 40-yard dash. Don't count it twice. You already knew the guy was slow. Just like if you know a guy's fast and then they go out there and run a 4.3, don't count it twice. So I think the same logic applies here to this miss of a pick that is Boogie Basham for Brandon Beane. All right, in just a moment here, we're going to go position by position and really talk about this initial roster. But first, need to tell you about LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available, and that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. And folks, it is so easy to create a free job post over at LinkedIn Jobs. And once you do, you add the job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. And then simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. That's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, let's take a look at this roster. This initial 53-man roster for the Buffalo Bills. Talk about it position by position. We'll focus on the offense for this segment. And, of course, we'll get to the defense. At quarterback, Josh Allen, Kaiir Elam, they make the roster. Matt Barkley goes to injured reserve. We talked about this. The severity of the elbow injury is pretty significant. I gave you some clues over the last couple of weeks about that. So this was something I was expecting. And so for Matt Barkley, obviously, there's probably some good news for him. I don't think he was going to make the roster. Now he gets his full pay for the season. He could still choose to be around the team if he'd like to, but won't be able to play or practice. But I think his role as an asset to Josh Allen can still exist. That said, the Bills will need to add a third quarterback. And there's some options out there, right? We've seen some options. Bailey Zappi got released, PJ Walker, Colt McCoy, Jake Fromm. There are options out there to fill this role as QB3, which is basically going to run the scout team and be an emergency type player should you have an injury to Josh or Kaiir Elam. So a move is definitely coming at quarterback. We'll see what it is. But Josh Allen, Kaiir Elam, 2 quarterbacks make the initial roster. At running back, including fullback Reggie Gilliam, the Bills kept 4, the exact 4 we anticipated them keeping: Reggie Gilliam, James Cook, Latavius Murray, Damian Harris, which means Ty Johnson, Darrington Evans, Jordan Mims all don't make the roster. I would guess Ty Johnson and Darrington Evans are strong candidates to come back on the practice squad. I'd love for the Bills to get Ty Johnson back on the practice squad, to have that guy as your 4th running back that provides that special teams value, gives you some speed. I think he's a nice player. I think he's a rosterable player. And so I'm hopeful that the Bills get him back on the practice squad. But for now, Gilliam, Cook, Murray, and Harris, your Bills running backs at this point in time. At wide receiver, I know that there was a lot of interest in how this would go. Well, it wound up going the way we kind of knew it was going to go back when we talked about this roster makeup back in May. Stefon Diggs, Gabe Davis, Trent Sherfield, Deontay Hardy, Khalil Shakir, Justin Shorter. Now, here's the deal with Justin Shorter. Joe Buscaglia of The Athletic has reported that the Bills intend on putting him on in-season injured reserve. So that means that he's going to go on injured reserve, and then the Bills will have a roster spot that they can add somebody back. And I think that somebody that they bring back could be Andy Isabella, could be Keyshawn Johnson, but probably Andy Isabella. I think the Bills kind of developed a bit of an affinity for him and what he was able to do in the short amount of time when the Bills signed him, like right when camp started. And so I think there's a world where he comes back tomorrow, right? He's a veteran, 4 years of experience, doesn't have to clear waivers or anything like that. So this could be a situation where Justin Shorter goes to the injured reserve and then they bring back Andy Isabella. But the Bills did have to say goodbye to some receivers, at least for now. Brian Thompson, Keyshawn Johnson, Andy Isabella, Tyrell Shavers, Desmond Patton, Marcel Aitman, and Isaiah Coulter. I'm sure a couple of those are back on the practice squad, in addition to probably at least one going to the active roster. At tight end, this was chalk. Figured it would be. They keep 3. Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox, Quentin Morris. They make the roster. Jace Sternberger, Joel Wilson don't make the roster. I'm sure they'd like to get one or both of those players back to the practice squad. Offensive line is where things got a little bit interesting. It was what I predicted it would be, but I still thought that was a bit of a roll of the dice. But it winds up being, like I talked about on our last conversation, or the 53-man projection that I did on Sunday. Mitch Morse, Connor McGovern, Osiris Torrance, Spencer Brown, Deion Dawkins, Ryan Bates, David Edwards. We knew that. It's the next 2. It was 8 and 9 that was interesting, and it winds up being Ryan Vandemark and Alec Anderson. I think those guys earned it. Those guys had strong preseasons. a lot of growth as practice squad players last year developed all season long and then took advantage of their opportunity throughout OTAs, camp, and preseason to win roster spots. I think they earned it. Now, you can be very concerned that there's not experienced tackle depth. I understand that completely. But if you watch the tape, it wasn't hard to see that Ryan Vandemark's better than David Quessenberry. And David Quessenberry was released, along with Kevin Jarvis, Nick Broker, a draft pick, Richard Garage, Ike Bucker, and Greg Manns. So Alec Anderson goes out there and beats out Ike Bucker, who's been on this roster. And Ryan Vandermark goes out and beats out David Quessenberry, who's been on this roster. Now, I'm sure the Bills would love to get Quess, Nick Broker as a draft pick, probably Ike Bucker back on their practice squad, maybe even Richard Garage. There's certainly worthy players that you'd like to keep around on the practice squad. But I think Alec Anderson and Ryan Vandemark deserve a lot of credit for going out there and earning these jobs. Again, concerned about the tackle depth from an experience perspective. And I wonder what this looks like if Brandon Shell makes the roster and doesn't retire. That's not important. He retired, so it doesn't matter. But I think this team from an interior depth perspective is really, really strong with David Edwards and Ryan Bates both available as backups. And I think these are some intriguing young developmental offensive linemen that have already proven a lot making this initial roster. And you kind of wonder what the trajectory is here. Is Alec Anderson the next Ryan Bates? You know, a guy that can play a bunch of spots, probably best on the interior, but can get you through a game at any position. Can Ryan Vandemark continue his trajectory and be the swing tackle at worst for this team? Is he a guy that can challenge Spencer Brown at some point? I like the path that these guys are headed. They earn jobs, and I think that's awesome. All right, folks, we got to talk about the defensive side of the football. Stick with me. Need a quick break? I'll be right back. All right, folks, let's talk about the defense. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to join the Locked On Bills subtext community. Folks, if you aren't in the subtext community, you missed a really fun day on Cut Day. I was sharing my thoughts all day long as it happened with everybody, and it was super fun. So check it out. There's a link to join in today's show notes. Whether you're on YouTube or wherever you listen to this podcast, click on the show notes. There's a link to join, something that we launched a few months ago, and it's been so cool. I send out mass text messages to everyone all the time, at least once a day, on days like Tuesday when cuts were happening or during games. There's quite a bit that comes from me, but love being able to interact with you. I'm only a text message away, a direct line right to me. Super fun. We've done some exclusive things in there, some content, some giveaways. So check it out. Again, a link in today's show notes to join the Locked On Bills subtext community. And everyone gets a free 2-week trial to start. So check it out. Would love for you to join. All right, let's talk about the defense and who made it. Obviously, we've kind of gotten into defensive end already with Von Miller starting on the PUP list and then Boogie Basham being traded. So only one cut here. Cameron Klein is cut. I'm sure the Bills want him back on the practice squad, but Greg Rousseau, Leonard Floyd, AJ Epinesa, Shaq Lawson, and Kingsley Jonathan make the roster. How about that? Kingsley Jonathan, another guy that went out there and earned it. Now, what was harder to project about Kingsley making the roster was I don't feel like we saw a lot of him running with the first or second team. You know, he was running with kind of the 3s and the 4s, and he was making plays and doing well, but I was a little surprised that he made the roster after not really getting those chances, at least in the preseason and the camp practices that I was able to see. But, you know, he's been flashy, obviously, throughout preseason, had a couple of moments last year. I think he played in that Bears game where he flashed. You know, he was part of the Bills mix last year throughout preseason. He winds up getting waived during final cuts, and then the Bears sign him to their active roster, and then he eventually gets back to Buffalo. So he gets this opportunity. He takes full advantage, makes this team, and it'll be interesting. I don't know if he'll be a game day active player. I'm certainly curious what this all looks like when Von Miller returns, because are you going to roster 6? Does it take care of itself with an injury? Do you say goodbye to somebody at a different position? But for now, Kingsley Jonathan on this roster to go with Lawson, Epinesa, Floyd, and Rousseau at defensive end. Defensive tackle went pretty much how we thought it would. The 5 that you expected to make the roster do make the roster, and Daquan Jones, Ed Oliver, Poona Ford, Jordan Phillips, and Tim Settle. So the Bills keep 10 total defensive linemen to start the year. And that means Ely, Anku, Cortez Broughton, DJ Dale, Kendall Vickers were all cut. I'm sure any combination of 2 or 3 of those are back on the practice squad. Ely Anku, a guy that's been around, you'd love to get him back on the practice squad, in addition to one of Broughton, Dale, or Vickers. So the Bills had a lot of depth there. I think it kind of played out how you would expect, but a strong group for the Bills at defensive tackle. At linebacker, this kind of went how we'd expected as well. Matt Milano, Terrell Bernard, Tyrell Dotson, Dorian Williams, Tyler Medikevich, and Balin Spector make this initial roster. That means A.J. Klein, Traven Howard, and Deshaun White were all released. Now, Balin Spector is a player I'd like to bring up here quickly. He's another player that Joe Buscaglia reported is going to go on in-season injured reserve. He's got a hamstring injury. McDermott called it a week-to-week injury. And so tomorrow he'll get put on injured reserve, and then the Bills will be able to bring a player back. And let me skip ahead to specialists, because Reed Ferguson, the Bills long snapper, was released today. It's a formality. I told you yesterday that he was going to get released and that they'd bring him back. So he's going to wait in the parking lot for a few hours, and he's going to come right back and be the Bills long snapper. Reed's done that just about every year that I can remember. He has no guaranteed money on his deal, so he just plays along, and it allows the Bills to keep an extra player on the roster. And so that's a really cool thing that happens every year. Smart roster gymnastics by Brandon Beane, and Reed Ferguson, good guy for doing that and helping the Bills to keep a lot of their young players. It's happened every year. So Balin Spector will go to injured reserve. Reed Ferguson will be back on the roster. I think the interesting name here in terms of the cuts is A.J. Klein. A.J. Klein was kind of getting some first-team opportunities here as the camp moved along, as preseason moved along with Terrell Bernard's injury. But at the end of the day, A.J. Klein is not a player that you have to be concerned with going to another team. The Bills will be able to get him right back on the practice squad, and if they need him, they'll call him up off the practice squad, and he could be part of the mix if necessary. But Brandon Beane said when they signed him that he was brought back to be an asset to the room. And so I think out of necessity, he started. Maybe that was a little bit too, or when he never started, he got first team reps. I'm sure part of that was to inspire Tyrell Dotson a little bit, but I think he ultimately went on the path I expected him to as a player that was released and that the Bills will probably like to get back on their practice squad. So your linebackers, Milano, Bernard, Dotson, Williams, Medikevich, and Spector. Gets us to cornerback. This went exactly how I thought. Trey White, Dane Jackson, Christian Benford, Kaiir Elam, Taron Johnson, Saran Neal. They all make the team. Alex Austin, a draft pick. Kyron Brown, Jamarcus Ingram, all waived. Austin and Ingram, you know the Bills would love to get them back on the practice squad. I worry about Jamarcus Ingram. I think somebody might claim him, and somebody should. I think Jamarcus Ingram's a guy that's roster worthy in the NFL that I think could play outside corner, slot corner, be an asset on special teams. There's just not a spot for him with the Bills. But if they can get him back on the practice squad, I think that would be outstanding for the team. And just knowing that he's at your disposal if you need him. I've really grown to appreciate Jamarcus Ingram. So hopefully he can stick around. At safety, they keep 5 of those. So 11 total defensive backs. Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, Taylor Rapp, Damar Hamlin, Cam Lewis. And that means Dean Marlowe, Zane Anderson, Jared Maiden are cut. I'm sure, again, a couple of those back on the practice squad, especially Dean Marlowe, given his time that he has with Sean McDermott. And just a veteran like that on your practice squad is very, very helpful. But the big story here, well, Cam Lewis, give him his flowers. Never thought he wasn't going to make this mix. I thought he had a great camp in preseason. But Damar Hamlin, he did it. He came back. He earned this spot. That's the thing that I'm really enjoying about Damar making this roster is I don't think anybody didn't think he deserved it, right? It's not a courtesy thing. It's not, hey, cool story. You got healthy. You overcame the odds. You're back. We love that. We want the PR. No, Damar earned it. And I'll tell you this about Damar. I think he absolutely showed growth, displayed growth as a football player from what we watched last year to what we've seen in preseason. My biggest concerns with Damar Hamlin, the player, was just not playing under enough control moving forward, and that leading to some bad angles and some missed tackles. Well, based on what we saw in preseason, he's cleaned that up. He's made some tough open field tackles. He's been able to fill downhill with good angles and with good control, and I think he's shown growth. And so it's an exciting trajectory for a young player that got a chance to start 13 games last year and will be an asset to this team as a depth player, special teams, but also right back into that conversation as we consider what happens post Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer. You might have their successors on the roster in Taylor Rapp and Damar Hamlin. And I think that Damar Hamlin's earned the right to be back into that conversation, and just obviously an incredible story. He's going to be the comeback player of the year. He earned this roster spot, and he deserves that award. In terms of specialists, Tyler Bass, Sam Martin make the team. Reed Ferguson's cut for now. He's going to be signed back tomorrow. You'll have your long snapper. Pretty straightforward there. So there's your Bills initial roster. Obviously, there's some things that are coming. You're going to see a quarterback added. You're going to see a practice squad filled up. We'll see what tomorrow brings. There's going to be different things that happen along the way that I think will obviously shape things. So the Bills could, they put in waiver claims. You don't know who you're going to get. There's corresponding moves. So this is the initial roster, but there is definitely more to come. And that we're going to break it down for you here on this podcast. So a lot to get to here the rest of the week with those moves coming. I have a guest lined up, maybe two. We'll see. I should know more about that tomorrow. I owe you my stat predictions. We got herd mentality. That Jets game's coming up. Busy times here on the Locked On Bills podcast. So make sure that you stick with me. Hit that subscribe button. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills. And I look forward to catching up with you again tomorrow.